The babysitter had come highly recommended. Her name was Hannah, a university student looking to make extra money. I met her through a colleague at work who swore she was reliable. She had a quiet, polite way about her, the sort of person who doesn't overstay their welcome. That was exactly what I needed, someone to care for Jamie while I worked late shifts or ran errands. The nanny cams were an afterthought, really, a precaution. Not because I distrusted Hannah, but because I couldn't ignore the anxiety that came with leaving my son with anyone. They were discreet, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in Jamie's room. I liked the thought of being able to check in whenever I wanted, even if it was just for peace of mind. Things went smoothly for the first couple of weeks. Hannah showed up on time. Jamie seemed to like her, and I had no complaints. On my nights off, I'd sit on the sofa after Jamie was asleep, flicking through the footage on my phone. Most of it was dull. Hannah reading to Jamie, playing with his toy cars, making dinner. It became a habit to skim through it before bed, less out of suspicion and more because I was curious about how my son spent his evenings. One night I was scrolling through the day's footage. The living room feed showed Hannah on the floor with Jamie building some kind of fort out of cushions. She got up to fetch something from the kitchen, leaving Jamie sitting cross-legged on the carpet. As the video played, I noticed movement behind him just beyond the window. It was faint, a dark shape against the pale glow of the garden light. For a moment I thought it was a trick of the shadows or maybe a tree swaying in the wind. But as I scrubbed back and played the clip again, it became clear. A man stood there, still and quiet, barely more than a silhouette. He was facing the window, his outline unmistakable. My stomach turned over as I stared at the screen. The camera didn't have sound, but I could imagine the silence of that moment, the only noise being Jamie's babbling as he played. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward or retreat. He just stood there. I checked the timestamp. It was around 7:30, a time when I was usually at work and Hannah was getting Jamie ready for bed. I switched to the kitchen feed, searching for any sign of him there. The camera angle didn't cover the garden, but I could see Hannah moving around, oblivious. I spent the rest of the night glued to the footage, scouring every minute for another glimpse of the figure. But he didn't appear again. The garden was empty and the rest of the evening unfolded as usual. The next day, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I convinced myself it was a stranger, maybe someone who'd cut through the garden by mistake. It was an unsettling thought, but I tried to rationalize it. My garden backed onto an alley, and people occasionally used it as a shortcut. Still, I couldn't let it go. I spent the morning adjusting the locks on the doors and double-checking the windows. When Hannah arrived that evening, I found myself scrutinizing her too, though she gave me no reason to doubt her. That night, I set an alarm to wake me in the early hours. I sat in the dark with the live feed from the cameras on my phone, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The garden was quiet, the house still. It was 2 nights later when I saw him again. This time, it was on the live feed. I was lying in bed, scrolling absently through my phone, when I opened the app, and there he was. Standing at the same window, his face obscured by the glare of the light, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, paralyzed, my thumb hovering over the phone as I tried to decide what to do. He moved slightly, a small shift of his body, and something about the motion struck me as familiar. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling to piece together what I was seeing. I grabbed my keys and crept downstairs, locking the front door and peering through the peephole. The garden was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called the police. They came, took my statement, and promised to patrol the area. But the man didn't come back for a while, and I began to question myself. Was I overreacting? Imagining things? Then a week later I found something tucked under the garden gate, a photograph of Jamie and me. It was an old one from before the divorce. I recognized the handwriting on the back. I knew who it was. I knew, and I realized the cameras weren't there to keep an eye on the babysitter anymore. They were there for him, and he wasn't going away. I'd moved into my flat a few weeks before I noticed him. The building across the street was similar to mine, plain brick, tall and narrow with balconies jutting out from each unit. Most of them were cluttered with plants, laundry racks and the odd bicycle. It was easy to ignore, especially with the curtains drawn, but one evening as I went to close them, I glanced out and saw the man. He was standing on a balcony 2 floors up, leaning slightly against the rail. The dim orange light from his flat behind him threw his face into shadow, but it was unmistakable that he was holding a camera. The lens was pointed straight at me. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. Then I stepped back, letting the curtains fall shut. I told myself it could be anything. He could be photographing the street or something in the background. And maybe it was a coincidence. That night, I kept thinking about it, replaying the moment in my mind. There was nothing else to do but move on. Maybe he'd been a tourist, snapping shots of the city skyline. It wasn't unusual, and I had no reason to think it had anything to do with me. But it happened again the next evening. The man was there, standing in the same spot. His posture was casual, like he didn't have a care in the world, but the camera was unmistakable. It was larger than I'd noticed before, a proper piece of kit, not just a phone or something harmless. Once again, it was pointed directly at my flat. I ducked behind the curtain and stayed there, peeking out every few minutes. He didn't move, didn't fidget. He just stayed there, fixed in place. It wasn't until the light in his flat switched off and he disappeared inside that I felt like I could breathe properly again. The next morning I stood on the pavement, looking up at his building. It wasn't hard to pick out his balcony. There was nothing on it, no plants, no furniture, just an empty space with a railing. I didn't see any movement from his flat, but that didn't mean much. He could have been anywhere. For a few days I tried not to think about it. I kept the curtains closed and went about my life as usual. But every so often I'd catch myself glancing towards the balcony, half expecting to see him there. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then one night I noticed something strange. The light in his flat was off, but the camera was still there, perched on the balcony rail. Its lens gleamed faintly in the glow from the streetlights. It was positioned perfectly, angled towards my window. I couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow seemed darker. I found myself constantly looking towards the window. Even though the curtains were drawn, the idea of that camera being out there, pointed at me, was unbearable. The next day I decided to confront him. I walked across the street and stood at the entrance to his building, staring up at the balcony. I couldn't see him, but the camera was still there. It didn't move as I stood there, its lens lifeless and indifferent. I went inside and took the lift up to his floor. When I reached his door, I knocked hard, my hands shaking. It took a while for him to answer. When he did, he looked at me with an expression that was almost bored. I explained what I'd seen, pointing out how his camera had been aimed at my flat. He barely reacted, shrugging it off like it was nothing. He told me he hadn't been taking photos of me, that I'd misunderstood. I didn't believe him, but what could I do? I couldn't prove anything. I walked back to my flat, feeling helpless. That night, I checked again. The light in his flat was on, but the balcony was empty. The camera was gone. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe he'd taken it down. Maybe he'd listened, even if he didn't admit it. Then, just before I closed the curtains, I saw him again. He was standing in his living room, his face half lit by the lamp behind him. He wasn't holding the camera this time. He didn't need to. It was mounted on a tripod, aimed directly at my window. My chest tightened and I stepped back, letting the curtains fall. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I sat on the sofa, my eyes darting towards the window every few minutes, even though I knew I couldn't see anything. The next day I called the building manager. They promised to look into it, but didn't sound particularly concerned. People could be odd, they said, but it didn't necessarily mean anything sinister. That didn't make me feel better. Over the next week, I noticed the camera more often. It wasn't always on the balcony. Sometimes it was inside his flat, just visible through the window. Other times it was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. One night I woke up to a sound, soft and faint, like something brushing against the window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and turned on the bedside lamp. The curtains were drawn, but the thought of what might be on the other side made my skin crawl. I didn't get out of bed, I didn't move at all. I just sat there, staring at the curtain, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't, but the next morning, when I looked out the window, I noticed something. In the dirt just below my flat, there were footprints. They were deep and clear, and they led directly to my window. I don't know what to do now. I keep the curtains closed, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still there. That he's still watching. I've started hearing noises at night, soft taps and creaks that make my stomach turn. I tell myself it's nothing, but I can't help but wonder. I decided to book the Airbnb because it looked charming. Nothing too fancy, but clean, private, and far enough from the city to feel like a real getaway. The photos showed a cozy, sunlit cottage with wooden beams and a little garden out back. It seemed perfect for a quiet weekend. The host greeted me when I arrived. He was friendly, overly so, with a toothy smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. He gave me a quick tour, pointing out the quirks of the house: creaky floorboards, an old lock on the bathroom door that didn't always catch, and a temperamental kettle. I wasn't too bothered. It was quaint and I liked that about it. I thanked him and he left, but not before saying I could reach out at any time if I needed something. The first night passed uneventfully. I made myself a cup of tea, read a book, and went to bed early. It felt peaceful. The morning was even better. Sunlight poured through the windows and birds chirped in the garden. For the first time in weeks, I felt relaxed. I went into town later that day, exploring the little shops and grabbing a coffee at a cafe. That's when I saw him, the host. He waved enthusiastically, coming over to chat. His friendliness hadn't struck me as odd before, but something about it now felt off. He mentioned that he'd noticed I'd been reading by the fire last night and that I must have been tired to head to bed so early. I hadn't mentioned any of that to him. My smile faltered, and I made an excuse to leave, pretending I had errands to run. Walking back to the cottage, I replayed the conversation in my head. How could he have known? The cottage was supposed to be private. No shared spaces, no reason for him to check in on me. Maybe he'd seen the light through the curtains, I thought. Or maybe it was just a guess. Back at the Airbnb, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, but every sound made me jump. I started looking around the place with new eyes, scanning the corners of each room, checking behind furniture. That's when I found it. The camera was hidden in a clock on the bedside table. It looked like an ordinary digital clock, but when I picked it up, I noticed the tiny lens embedded in the front. My stomach turned as I realized what it was. I turned it over in my hands, and sure enough, there was a small slot for a memory card. It was empty, but that didn't make me feel any better. The fact that it was there at all was enough. I started searching the rest of the cottage. Every room felt tainted now, every object suspect. In the kitchen I found another one tucked behind a vent cover. In the bathroom there was one disguised as a motion sensor. They were everywhere. I wanted to leave immediately, but my car was parked out front in plain view of the road. I didn't know where the host was or if he was watching me right now. The idea of running into him again made my skin crawl. Instead, I packed my things and sat in the living room fully dressed with my bag by the door. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call for help if I needed to. Hours passed, but I didn't move. The light outside faded and the cottage grew darker. I stayed where I was, staring at the clock on the wall, counting the minutes. I thought I heard footsteps outside at one point, but when I peeked through the curtains, the driveway was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. Eventually, I decided to leave. It was late, and the roads would be quiet. I grabbed my bag, opened the door, and stepped outside. The air was cool and still, and the cottage looked so ordinary in the moonlight, like nothing had happened. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove away. I didn't look back. It was just after dusk when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone, but that didn't seem unusual. Sometimes deliveries came late or someone got lost. I glanced through the peephole and saw a man standing on the porch. He was ordinary looking, wearing a plain jacket and jeans, holding his hands at his sides. He had the sort of face you wouldn't notice in a crowd. I opened the door just wide enough to ask what he wanted. He apologized and said he'd made a mistake, that he had the wrong address. Then he smiled, nodded, and turned to go. I closed the door, bolted it, and thought no more about it. Mistakes happen, after all. Over the next few days, I spotted him a few more times around the neighborhood. Once, he was walking down the pavement as I drove past. Another time, I saw him standing at the bus stop near the corner. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence. He could have been anyone, a resident, a visitor, someone passing through. But there was something about him that stuck in my mind. Maybe it was the way he stood, too still, or the fact that he seemed to have no purpose. On the third day, I noticed footprints in the dirt outside the windows at the back of the house. The ground was damp from a recent rain, and the marks were fresh. They didn't match my shoes, and I hadn't had any visitors. I walked the perimeter of the house, checking the windows and doors, but everything was locked. The footprints didn't lead anywhere, just a few scattered impressions in the dirt as though someone had been standing there. That night I double-checked all the locks before going to bed. I drew the curtains tightly and left a light on in the hallway. I wasn't afraid, not exactly, but I felt uneasy. The next morning I noticed something else. The recycling bin at the side of the house had been moved. It wasn't far from where it usually sat, just enough to make me notice. I wheeled it back into place, convincing myself the wind must have shifted it. Though the weather had been calm, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. A couple of nights later, I was in the living room, reading on the sofa, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned towards the window and froze. There, just beyond the glass, was the man. He was peering in, his face close enough to fog the glass. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something. He didn't see me at first. I was sitting in the shadow of the lamp, hidden from his view. My heart pounded as I tried to think of what to do. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just watched him. He stayed there for what felt like an eternity, his breath leaving faint marks on the glass. Then, as if sensing something, he straightened and looked directly at me. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I bolted to the door and locked it, then checked all the windows. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the locks. I grabbed my phone and hovered over the number for the police, but stopped. What could I say? That someone had looked through my window? By the time they arrived, he'd be long gone. I stayed up all night, sitting in the living room with every light on. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the house sent a shiver down my spine. But nothing else happened. The next morning I found more footprints outside the window. They were deep and clear, as though someone had stood there for hours. Over the next few days, I kept the curtains drawn and barely left the house. Each time I walked past a window, I felt the urge to peek out, but I resisted. I didn't want to know if he was out there. The nights were the worst. I started sleeping with the television on, its faint glow keeping the dark at bay. But sleep didn't come easily. Then one night, I woke to a sound. Not a loud noise, just the faint scrape of something against the outside wall. My heart raced as I lay there, paralyzed, straining to hear more. I crept out of bed and into the hallway. The sound had stopped, but I could feel a presence, something just beyond the walls of the house. I didn't turn on the lights, I didn't look out the window, I just stood there, listening. Eventually, the silence returned. I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep. The next morning I found another note. This one wasn't on paper. It had been written on the window, traced in the condensation. It said, "I know you're here." I packed a bag and left the house that day, locking the door behind me. I didn't know where I was going, just that I couldn't stay. When I ended things with Jason, I thought that would be it. We hadn't been together long enough for anything to get too complicated. A few months of dating, some weekends spent together, and then it became clear we just didn't work. He wasn't cruel or anything, but there was something about the way he always seemed to push at boundaries, like a child testing what they could get away with. That wore me down. In the end, it was surprisingly amicable, or so I thought. He didn't argue when I told him I needed space and that I didn't think we were right for each other. He even said he understood. We exchanged our things, clothes, books, chargers, all that, and after a few weeks of silence, I assumed it was all behind me. About a month later, I received the first message. It came from an account I didn't recognize, a username made up of random letters and numbers. The message was short and casual, asking if I'd had a good day. It didn't seem out of place at first. I figured it was spam and deleted it without replying. The next day, another message arrived. This one mentioned the coffee shop I'd been to that morning. I'd posted a photo of my latte on Instagram, so I thought someone had stumbled across my profile and decided to reach out. Creepy, but not unheard of. I adjusted my privacy settings and blocked the account. The messages didn't stop. Over the next week, more accounts popped up, each sending me something small and innocuous. Comments about my daily routine, remarks about the places I visited. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just someone being nosy, piecing things together from my social media. I even took down most of my posts, thinking that would solve it. Then they started mentioning things I hadn't shared online. One message brought up the color of the jumper I'd worn to the supermarket that morning. Another asked if I still had the book on my nightstand, the one I'd bought but never got around to reading. A particularly chilling one described the faint scratch on my phone case, something only someone who'd seen it up close would know. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in bed with the curtains drawn, scrolling through my phone and blocking every strange account I could find. My hands were shaking as I checked the locks on the door 3 times before finally lying down, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke up to another message. This one was different. It was longer, more personal. It apologized if the messages had upset me and said they only wanted to talk. They liked how kind I was, how easy it had been to be around me. They missed me. That's when I realized it wasn't a stranger. It had to be Jason. The little details, the tone of the messages, it all clicked. He'd known about the scratch on my phone because he'd borrowed it once. He'd been the one to buy me the book I hadn't read yet. It was him, I was sure of it. I didn't confront him, I didn't see the point. Instead, I blocked his number and deleted him from my contacts. I considered messaging him through a mutual friend, telling him to stop, but something about it felt futile. He hadn't been overtly threatening, just there in a way that gnawed at me. For a few days the messages stopped. I started to relax, thinking maybe he'd taken the hint and backed off. Then, late one night, I noticed something outside my window. I live on the ground floor, and my flat faces a narrow alleyway. It's not the kind of place where people just pass through, unless they have a reason. As I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up and saw movement, a faint shift in the dim light from the street lamp. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and stared out into the darkness. There was no one there, just the alley, damp and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of sight. I spent the rest of the night checking the locks on my windows and doors. The next day I went to a hardware store and bought a new deadbolt, installing it myself, even though I had no idea what I was doing. It made me feel a little better, though not much. The messages returned. This time they referenced things that had happened inside my flat. One mentioned the cup of tea I'd spilled on the carpet. Another brought up the way I'd left my shoes by the door instead of putting them away. I searched every inch of the flat looking for a hidden camera or microphone. I checked the smoke detectors, the light fixtures, even the tiny gaps in the skirting boards. Nothing, but the messages kept coming. The final straw came a week later when I found a note tucked into my letterbox. It wasn't mailed. Someone had slipped it in by hand. The handwriting was familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. Jason had left me a birthday card once, back when we were still dating. He'd signed it with a little flourish, the same one I saw at the bottom of the note. It said, "You can't ignore me forever." That night, I didn't stay in the flat. I packed a bag and drove to a friend's place, refusing to explain why I was suddenly so eager to sleep on their couch. I thought about calling the police, but couldn't bring myself to do it. What would I even tell them? The messages stopped after that. The accounts vanished, the notes ceased, and Jason didn't try to contact me directly. But every so often, I catch myself glancing out the window at night, half expecting to see a shadow in the alleyway or a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. University life wasn't what I'd expected. I had pictured something more vibrant, more alive, with parties and laughter spilling out into the halls. Instead, I found myself buried in coursework, most nights, spent alone in my dorm room. It suited me, though. I wasn't much for socializing, and the few friends I'd made were more acquaintances than confidants. That was how I met Ben. He sat 2 rows behind me in our shared psychology seminar, quiet and easy to overlook. I probably wouldn't have noticed him at all if he hadn't offered to share his notes after I missed a lecture. I hadn't been particularly friendly. It was more of a polite thanks and a promise to return the favor if he ever needed it. Over the next few weeks, he began offering small gestures of help, printing off handouts, saving me a seat in the lecture hall, holding the door open when he saw me coming. He was shy but pleasant, and I didn't think much of it. People are kind sometimes, even when there's nothing to gain. Then he began asking me to hang out, always in a casual, almost offhand way. A coffee after class, a study session in the library, lunch at the canteen. I had a ready excuse every time: coursework, appointments, other plans. It wasn't that I disliked him, but I wasn't interested in anything more than polite conversation. He didn't push, though. He always smiled and shrugged, saying maybe another time. It was around then that I started noticing him outside my dorm building. At first it was during the day, sitting on a bench near the entrance, seemingly absorbed in his phone. It didn't feel odd at the time. Lots of students hung around the dorms, either waiting for friends or taking a break between classes. But after a few days, I began seeing him there in the evenings too. He wasn't sitting anymore. He stood near the bike racks, hands in his pockets, scanning the entrance as though looking for someone. I brushed it off, reasoning that it was just a coincidence. We were in the same seminar after all. Maybe he lived nearby or had friends in the building, but the more I noticed him, the harder it became to ignore, especially when it began happening late at night. The first time I saw him after dark was around 10 p.m. I'd been at the library finishing an essay and was walking back to my dorm, the campus mostly quiet at that hour. As I approached the building, I spotted him near the lamppost just outside the main entrance. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at the building. I didn't stop or look too closely, just swiped my ID card to get inside. I could feel his presence even after the door shut behind me, the weight of being observed pressing on my back as I climbed the stairs to my room. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. I'd see him outside the building and always in the same spot, sometimes at odd hours, midnight, 2 a.m., once even close to 4 in the morning when I'd gotten up for water and happened to glance out the window. He was just there. I considered reporting it to someone, a campus security, a resident advisor, anyone, but what could I say? That a classmate was standing outside my dorm? He wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't even trying to interact with me. He was just present, and somehow that felt worse. I started taking small precautions. I avoided walking alone after dark and kept my curtains drawn. I deleted his messages from my phone when they came, always polite, always asking if I wanted to study or grab a coffee. I started changing my route to and from class, though it was impossible to avoid him entirely. One evening, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I told the dorm manager about it, describing his repeated presence and how it was making me uncomfortable. She nodded sympathetically and promised to inform campus security. I felt a little better after that, even if it was just knowing that someone else was aware. That night, I checked the window before going to bed. He wasn't there. The next day, campus security informed me they'd spoken to him. He'd claimed he was visiting a friend in the building and had no idea I felt uncomfortable. They said they'd keep an eye out, but that there wasn't much else they could do unless he caused a disturbance. That night, he was back. This time he wasn't by the lamppost. He was closer, standing directly outside the front entrance. His face was partially hidden by the hood of his jacket, but there was no mistaking him. My heart raced as I locked the door to my room, the reality of the situation sinking in. It wasn't until the following morning that I noticed something else. A note had been slipped under my door. No signature, no explanation, just one line, scrawled in shaky handwriting. You didn't have to ignore me. I didn't open the door for the rest of the day. The takeaway arrived 20 minutes earlier than the app said it would, which was a small victory on a long day. I didn't feel like cooking after work, so I'd ordered Thai from the place down the road. I'd used them a few times before. They weren't the cheapest, but the food was decent, and they'd always been reliable. The driver handed me the bag with a wide smile that made me a bit uncomfortable. I don't mean the kind of smile you give someone to be polite. It was too much, like he was performing for an invisible audience. He looked to be in his late 20s, with close-cropped hair and a uniform shirt that was slightly too tight around the arms. As I took the bag, he paused, shifting his weight slightly, and gave me a long look. It was the comments that caught me off guard. Not what you'd expect. Have a nice evening or something like that. He went out of his way to say things about me, how nice I looked, how friendly I seemed. All said with that same smile. I laughed awkwardly, mumbled a thanks, and closed the door. When I peeked out of the window a few minutes later, I saw him still sitting in his car. The engine was off, but the lights were on, and he was parked right outside my building. I figured maybe he was waiting for another delivery to come through, though something about it felt odd. After about 10 minutes, the car started, and he drove off. That should have been the end of it, except it wasn't. A few days later, as I was heading out to work in the morning, I noticed the same car parked across the street. The driver's seat was empty, and I couldn't see anyone nearby, so I dismissed it as a coincidence. But when I got home that evening, the car was still there, and this time he was sitting in it. He didn't look in my direction or make any move to acknowledge me. Just sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead. I hurried inside, heart thudding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. After that, I started noticing him more often, always in the same car, always near my building. Sometimes he'd be parked along the curb, sometimes a little further down the road, but never far enough away to feel random. Once or twice, I thought I saw him glance up at my flat, but I couldn't be sure. It might have been paranoia creeping in, or maybe I was looking for patterns where there weren't any. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That the driver from a takeaway delivery was hanging around my street? It felt absurd. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, even as I started double locking the door every night and keeping the curtains drawn. One evening, a week or so later, I was coming back from the shop when I saw him again. This time, he wasn't in his car. He was standing near the entrance to my building, leaning against the wall as though he was waiting for someone. My pulse quickened as I walked past, gripping my bag tightly. He didn't say anything or make any move toward me, but I could feel his eyes on me as I pushed through the door. I checked the peephole after locking the door behind me, but by then he was gone. It became a game of sorts. Or maybe it wasn't a game at all, and I was just the only one playing. I'd catch glimpses of him in his car, always parked within sight of my flat. Sometimes he'd be there for hours, other times just a few minutes. Once I saw him standing across the street smoking a cigarette, his gaze fixed on the building. I started taking different routes home, avoiding the front door when I could, but it didn't seem to matter. He always found a way to be there. Then one night I decided to check the app to see if I could learn anything about him. His profile was still listed under past orders with his name and photo. His name was Paul. The app showed he'd delivered my food 3 times, but I knew that wasn't true. I'd only seen him once before all this started. The profile didn't tell me much else, but it made the whole thing feel more real. He had a name now, a face I couldn't ignore. I considered calling the takeaway to complain, but what would I say? That their driver was being creepy? There wasn't any proof, not really. Just a series of odd encounters that might have been nothing. That night I woke up to a sound outside my window. I live on the 3rd floor, so it wasn't as if anyone could be standing there, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. I checked the cameras I'd set up after all of this began. The feeds showed nothing unusual. The street was quiet, the building still, but when I went to the window I could just make out the shape of a car parked down the road. The headlights flicked on and it drove away. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found a single rose on the welcome mat outside my flat. There was no note, no sign of who'd left it. But I knew. I didn't open the door until the building felt alive with movement again, until I heard other people coming and going. The car wasn't there anymore when I looked out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Paul hadn't gone far. It started the first night I moved into my new flat. The place was quiet, a quietness I had long craved after years of chaotic noise in my old life. The building itself wasn't much, just a tired block of flats, all concrete and chipped paint. But it was mine, a fresh start. Or so I thought. I spent the day unpacking, the hours ticking away as I lost myself in the rhythm of opening boxes and arranging things just so. By the time night fell, I was exhausted, collapsing onto my new bed with the satisfaction of someone who'd earned their rest. Then it started. A noise above me, footsteps, quick and light, as if someone was pacing. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. Perhaps the letting agent had been mistaken about the flat above mine being empty. Maybe a mistake in the paperwork, or someone had moved in while I was busy with my boxes. I tried to sleep, but the sound continued. The faint thump of heels against a floor that shouldn't have been occupied. I turned over, burying my head in the pillow, telling myself to ignore it. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off, only to wake up hours later to the same noise. The next day, I asked the building manager about it. I didn't want to seem too nosy, so I mentioned it casually. He confirmed what I already knew. The flat above mine was still listed as vacant. He even showed me the keys hanging on a board in his office. I laughed it off, pretending it was no big deal, but that night the sound came again. Every night, without fail, I would hear it. The footsteps started just as I began to drift off, an irregular patter that seemed to follow no pattern. Each time I told myself it was probably the building settling or some other reasonable explanation, but deep down I felt the doubt growing. The sound wasn't random. It moved as though someone were walking from room to room, pausing briefly in each before moving on. Days turned into weeks and the noise became a part of my nights. I stopped mentioning it to anyone. The few friends I still kept in touch with didn't need another reason to worry about me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just an odd quirk of the building. But then small things started happening in my flat, things I couldn't brush off as easily. My keys weren't where I'd left them. A chair in the kitchen seemed slightly out of place. I told myself I was just tired, distracted. It wasn't until I came home one evening to find the window in my bedroom open that the uneasiness settled in properly. I never opened that window, not once. I started triple-checking the locks. Every night I made sure the door was bolted, the windows secured. I stopped sleeping well, lying awake, straining to hear beyond the footsteps above. My own flat began to feel unfamiliar, as though it weren't quite mine anymore. One night I decided to check the flat upstairs. It was ridiculous, I told myself, childish even, but I had to know. Armed with a torch and a sharp kitchen knife I barely knew how to use, I made my way up the stairs. The hall outside the flat was dimly lit, the bulb above flickering faintly. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing, before finally working up the courage to turn the handle. The door was unlocked. The air inside smelled stale, like a place that hadn't been lived in for years. My torch beam swept across the room, revealing bare walls and an empty floor. It was just as the manager had said, unoccupied. But then I saw a mark on the floor, a scuff, faint but unmistakable, like something had been dragged. It led from the center of the room to the far corner, where a small access panel to the attic hung open. I turned and left, locking the door behind me with shaking hands. That night the footsteps didn't come, but something else did. The faint sound of breathing, close enough to feel it, stirring the hairs on the back of my neck.